this. Developmental psychology is the scientific study of how humans change over their lifespan from conception to death. So we're talking about physical, cognitive, psychosocial, pretty much all different aspects of potential change. And depending on the theory that you're talking about, development is seen as either being like a continuous kind of gradual process or taking place in stages. So when a mommy and a daddy love each other very much, they'll produce something that looks like a bundle of cells. This is the germinal stage of development, the first 2 weeks, where the zygote will divide rapidly and implant itself into the uterine wall. Now for the next 6 weeks, we're in the embryonic stage, and this is when the developing baby first starts to develop those, really important features like the brain and the spinal cord and most major organs. This is when the baby is first starting to look human. But it isn't until the following 30 weeks that we start to really see some clear development in the brain. So the brain is going to become a lot more complex during this final 30 weeks, which we call the fetal development stage. The bodily structures are going to be a lot more refined, and the size will just continually increase, and the child will accumulate fat.
A process that begins in the womb but continues long after the child is born is called neural migration. So this just refers to the fact that once the neural cells have been created through normal cellular division, they're going to migrate. So just think about that. This tiny little baby has all these cells being created and then literally moving throughout the brain in these huge migratory patterns. It's pretty chaotic what's going on in the child's brain at such an early age. And these migrating neural cells are immature, so that just means they don't really look like neurons yet. They don't have axons or dendrites at this point. And after they've migrated, after they've moved to the different areas that they need to be in, they'll start to align themselves with each other and create structures, neural structures. We call this aggregation. And when they start aggregating, when they start clumping together like this, that's when we'll see the axons and dendrites begin to grow. But not every single one of those neurons is going to be used. Approximately 50% more neurons are produced than are needed. So it's perfectly normal for many of these neurons to die off. Now, there's two kinds of neural death. The first is necrosis, and this is a kind of passive, unintentional cell death. This is the bad kind. This is typically caused by external factors like, harmful environmental agents like viruses or maybe brain damage, disease, whatever. And things that affect the child from the outside. And the reason why necrosis is such a big problem is that it can actually cause a chain reaction, killing off numerous cells. So one cell is destroyed and its chemicals are dumped out. Like this little cell just kind of pops and all the little chemicals go floating out. And those chemicals can affect surrounding cells and make those cells pop and dump their chemicals, and it's a big mess. But the other kind of neural death is called apoptosis. And this is an active, intentional kind of cell death. This is, to put it simply, the brain deciding that we don't need these neurons anymore and then basically starving them to death. So this is caused by chemical signals from other cells basically telling that neuron to kill itself. And this is much safer than necrosis. It doesn't have this kind of chain reaction type of an effect.
So we talk a lot about nature versus nurture when it comes to development. The nature part, that would be your heredity. That would be genetics, basically, your DNA. So the genetic transmission of physical and psychological characteristics from parents to their children. DNA, or deoxyribonucleic acid, this is a molecular structure shaped like a double helix. I'm sure you've heard a lot about this before. And that's what contains all your different chromosomes. You have 46 different chromosomes in your DNA that contain the genes for all the different parts of what you are.
Gregor Mendel did some of the first scientific research into what we now call genetics. And what he discovered was that just because you have a genetic trait in your genotype, that doesn't mean it's going to be in your phenotype. So genotype just refers to the traits that are present in your genes, those traits you've inherited from your parents. Whereas phenotype are the traits that are actually being expressed. Not all of your genes are going to be expressed.
Now, half of your chromosomes come from your mother and half come from your father. So literally, you are half your mother and half your father. But nobody looks like a perfect 50-50 mix of their two parents, and that's because some genes are dominant and some genes are recessive. So a gene is just a small segment that carries important information. And when a gene is dominant, that just means that whatever gene it's paired with is going to get suppressed. You're not going to see that be expressed in the individual. So here's an example. Blue eye gene is recessive when you pair it with the brown eye gene, which is dominant. So if you get a blue eye gene from your mother and a brown eye gene from your father, you will have brown eyes because that brown gene you got from your father dominates the blue eye gene that you got from your mother. So the only possible way you could have blue eyes is if you got a blue eye gene from both parents.
But of course it's not that simple, because genetic replication is messy. Every single time you copy your genetic code, numerous errors are going to be made. And this is why none of us are a perfect, 50-50 at the genetic level of our two parents. Most of the time, these mutations, these genetic mistakes, are insignificant and they go unnoticed. But sometimes these mutations can be pretty major and can have a real effect on us. They can either help or harm our chances of survival. And this is exactly how evolution works. Evolution works through genetic mistakes. If the genetic mistake is better for you, then you'll survive. If it's worse for you, then you won't. And these naturally occurring mutations are just going to be occurring at a higher rate the older you get.
So that's the nature. That's your heredity. The other aspect would be nurture, the environment. The sum of all the external conditions, everything that's going on around you that affects you, especially the effects of things like learning and experience. So there are many different kinds of things that affect a developing baby, but the ones we talk about the most are called teratogens. Teratogens are these environmental agents that can harm prenatal development. Things like narcotics, radiation, cigarette smoke, lead, cocaine, alcohol. Alcohol is, just like the rest of these, it's a very serious thing that pregnant mothers need to avoid contact with. A baby that's exposed, a developing baby that's exposed to alcohol could develop what's called fetal alcohol syndrome, which is caused by repeated heavy alcohol consumption during pregnancy. So infants who have fetal alcohol syndrome, or FAS, have a low birth weight, a small head, body defects, specific kinds of facial malformations, and along with emotional, behavioral, and mental handicaps. If you know what to look for, it's a pretty distinctive pattern of facial malformations, and you can fairly easily identify people who have this fetal alcohol syndrome. So when it comes to how sensitive the child is to the environment, the basic rule that we've discovered is that the younger the child is, the more sensitive that child is. So very early in life, even before birth, that child is going to be extremely sensitive to environmental influences. But we do know that there are specific periods. There are periods of sensitivity to certain kinds of environmental stimuli. You could also call these critical periods, where normal developmental things must occur. And if there's some, teratogens or some very serious environmental disturbance, then and that prevents this specific development from occurring, that can cause serious and long-term effects. When it comes to the kind of environment that children need, what they need is basically just an enriched environment. And when I say enriched, I mean it's deliberately made to be more complex, more intellectually stimulating, and emotionally supportive. Parents have taken steps, purposeful steps, to enrich the child's environment. And oftentimes the easiest way to do this is to just interact with the child, play with the child. Children who don't get this kind of enrichment are deprived. They're not getting that kind of normal stimulation that children need. They're not getting basic nutrition or comfort or love, and that will have serious detrimental effects. Now, the youngest children, newborns, we also call them neonates. If you've ever interacted with one, you know that they're very responsive right after birth. So as soon as they come out, they are already starting to look around and trying to interact with things. So their sensory capabilities and their motor capabilities are rapidly developing. But there are a certain, list of behaviors. There's certain kinds of behaviors that they are born with. These are like reflexes. So they don't have to learn these things. It's like they're coded into their genes that they are able to do these kinds of things. The most obvious thing that children can do right after birth is cry. But there are many specific reflexes that you can test. And if you have a young child, you probably should test these things just to make sure they're developing normally. So you have things like the grasping reflex, where if you put an object in the neonate's palm, in the newborn's palm, they'll grasp it automatically. And then you have a rooting reflex, where if you lightly touch the infant's cheek, they'll turn towards whatever was touching them in an attempt to nurse. This obviously helps the young child find food. Then you have the sucking reflex. If you touch an object to the infant's mouth, they'll start trying to suck on it. And then there's the Moro reflex, where if the baby's position is abruptly changed, like you drop the baby suddenly, or they're startled by a loud noise, they'll make a hugging motion like this. Like first they'll go out and then towards themselves like this. So I have a link to a video in the comments right down here listing many more of these kinds of reflexes and when you'll start to see them or when they'll start to fade away. Children's motor development occurs along the same basic pattern. So when you're seeing your child grow up, you should expect them to hit these kinds of milestones. Of course, each child is a little bit different, but there are these two separate patterns that most children will follow fairly well. So here's how it works. So you have two patterns. You have the cephalocaudal pattern, from head to toe, and then you have the proxodismal pattern, which is the center of the body to the extremities. So the child is learning how to use its spine and head, or the child is learning how to use its arms and legs. So when we talk about the first pattern, we're talking about just, being able to sit up straight, be able to look around. The child won't really be able to move its head to look at interesting things until at least a month or two of age. And it isn't around until the 4th or 5th month or maybe the 6th month that they'll be able to sit up unassisted and move their head about. But it's much later. It's about the 8th or 9th month that they really become able to support this massive head that they have with their spine. When it comes to controlling the arms and the legs, though, we have a separate pattern, like I said. So the child will first start to raise their butt as though they're about to crawl about the 2nd or 3rd month. Now, children generally don't crawl this early on, and if they do crawl, they tend to crawl backwards because their head is so big they can't lift it off the floor. So instead of pushing it, which is too hard, they'll just drag their head as they crawl backwards. And they can start doing a very basic kind of dancing walk if you support their weight. So they're clearly learning the basic idea of how to walk, but they can't do it on their own yet. They just don't have the strength. Around the 5th or the 6th month, that's when they'll start to crawl like a baby, like on their knees and hands. And it isn't until about the 7th or 8th month that they'll start crawling more like an adult would. And then this is around the same basic time that they can really start to support themselves while walking, but they lack balance. So they might be able to take a few steps, but then they'll always, fall down. And it isn't until much later, around, a year of age or so, that the child will be able to walk fully unassisted. So that's early motor development. But this going along with that at about the same time is also their early perceptual and cognitive development. If you look at, newborn babies and you make funny faces and things at them, you might be surprised when they mimic that. Newborns are natural mimics. They will try to, copy facial expressions and copy behaviors. Of course, like I was just talking about, their motor skills are severely limited when they're first born, but they are trying to, copy other people. The reason they do this seems to be to try to make sense of the world. So I have a couple of links down in the comments, just examples of young children mimicking. And children continue to mimic throughout their development. This can be especially obvious when the child is around, 2 to 3 years of age. That's why you really need to be careful about what you say and what you do around young children, because they're very likely to mimic that behavior. When it comes to social development, though, now we're talking about the child's need for emotional attachment, for physical contact with the caregivers. Children do definitely need to feel loved. They need to feel comfort. The study that really made this clear was a study conducted by a researcher by the name of Harlow, and what he found he called contact comfort. So contact comfort is something that children need, and it's this pleasant and reassuring feeling that babies get from touching something warm and soft, especially their mother. So this study by Harlow, it was really interesting. The study by Harlow is definitely considered to be controversial today, and it wouldn't be allowed to be conducted today because of how unethical it was. But like I've said in a previous video, back then they didn't really have the same kinds of ethics that we do. So here's what he did in his study. Harlow took baby monkeys away from their mothers. So very, very young monkeys. He took them away from their mothers, and he gave these baby monkeys a choice of 2 different surrogate mothers. So the surrogate mother just looked like, a really unconvincing fake monkey. Like it had something that kind of looked like a monkey head and then really rudimentary body. So there was 2 separate surrogate mothers like this. One of them could provide food. It had milk for the baby. The other one simply had a soft fabric wrapped around it. So that's the one that could provide comfort. And what he found, remarkably, is that the babies overwhelmingly chose comfort over food. So the end result of the study seems to be that comfort, feeling this emotional attachment, feeling love, is more important to a baby than food. Children, though, children normally get this kind of emotional attachment. They normally get this kind of contact comfort because parents just have this natural inclination to provide that emotional support. And a sure sign that the child has gotten that emotional support is separation anxiety. So it can be very distressing when, as a parent, you leave a room and your baby starts crying. This usually starts to become visible around 8 to 12 months of age. And you might think of it as a bad thing. It's like, oh, I'm making my baby cry by leaving the room. But in reality, that's a good thing. That shows you that the child cares about you and wants you to be there, wants you to be present. That just shows you that they are attached to you. Now, this can become a disorder if the child's distress doesn't fade away when you come back into the room. This can develop into what's called separation anxiety disorder. But most cases, it's a perfectly healthy, normal thing. Now, there is a way that you can test the attachment quality of your emotional attachment to your child. So this is based on the work of a researcher by the name of Ainsworth. And what she found is that there's 3 basic kinds of attachment quality. You have secure attachment, which is what most children have because, like I said, parents just have this kind of natural urge to provide that emotional support. So most children have a secure attachment where the child will show confidence when it comes to exploring an unfamiliar environment, as long as the caregiver is present. And when the caregiver leaves and comes back, they are quickly and readily comforted by the caregiver during this time of distress. So that's secure attachment. There's also avoidant attachment, where the child will show some confidence to explore an unfamiliar environment, but they don't seem to care whether or not their caregiver is present or absent. So when the caregiver leaves the room, it doesn't really bother them. And then finally, you have the ambivalent kind of attachment quality, where the child seems to be unwilling to explore an unfamiliar environment and seems to have mixed feelings about their caregiver. So they might start crying when that caregiver leaves the room, but they don't stop crying when the caregiver comes back. And depending on which of these 3 different attachment qualities the child develops to their parents, that will have long-lasting effects on their social life. So how they, the kinds of friendships they have, the kinds of, romantic or sexual relationships they have are going to be, severely affected by this early kind of emotional attachment. So I've included a link just showing an example of secure attachment in the comments. Make sure you check that out.